I'm Dennis Murphy from Sustainable Silicon Valley, and want to welcome you all for finding us here. Just a little bit about Sustainable Silicon Valley. We like to think we're a nonprofit think and do tank. So we like to, well, we focus on obviously on water use and reuse, as well as air quality and mobility, and a number of different things like decarbonization that will allow us to lead a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable life in the Bay Area. This graphic is from Ed Hawkins, famous for the kind of various stripes, which basically shows at a glance 12,000 years of temperatures against a 20th century baseline. If you look way over in the right corner here, and in this little screen, this is basically the major graphic trends of the Anthropocene and actually the industrial age, and we're hoping to try to reverse that in future. But so anyway, yes, this is me. There's a picture. I also just want to have to make note that we're apparently moving into a period of where we'll experience taco trucks in every corner, which I consider a good thing as a taco fan. I'd be remiss if I did not mention the next big thing on our calendar in December, early December 3rd and 4th, right after Thanksgiving, Waterpalooza. We're working to really put together 2 afternoons of content that will hopefully surprise, delight, and inspire. Waterpalooza. Say it with me. The other thing we've been working on is a program called Sustainable Life. And that is kind of part and parcel of the recognition that whatever we work on our little silos, we still have to make dinner, and we still have to do laundry and move around and do all kinds of things. And so we wanted to really give a kind of a focus on an area of sustainable living in pretty much all forms, and food you eat, clothes you wear, the whole bit. That is coming very soon. We have a great team working on things, and there'll be a lot of announcements shortly. Sorry about that. I'm have a hair trigger here, and a little bit of housekeeping. We did put out a kind of Google form for early questions, but we also have the opportunity for people to put questions in the Q&A, which kind of is specifically for questions. If you must, we'll also take questions off of the chat, and you may see some polling throughout the talk. But we'll try to keep that brief as well. So I'd like to introduce I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and they will speak in turn, and then we'll have we will have Q&A from all those good questions you'll put into Q&A. Ann Thebo is a senior researcher at the Pacific Institute. She focuses on spatial analysis and modeling to assess the benefits and trade-offs of integrated water management, water reuse, and alternative supplies. Ann holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from UC Berkeley, and where she focused on de facto water reuse in agriculture, combining Latin, water reuse, and agriculture. And Anne also has an MS in environmental engineering from Stanford and BS degrees in civil engineering and environmental science from the Ohio State University. She's worked previously as a water resources engineering consultant. Amelia Luna is a go-to civil engineer at Sherwood Design Engineers. She spearheads water reuse projects, including wastewater treatment, net zero water systems, water quality improvements within urban planning developments and corporate campuses, which is easy for you to say. Amelia's expertise includes process design and permitting of on-site water reuse systems, and permitting and compliance with the San Francisco ordinances like Article 12C and state on-site water reuse regulations that are some looking to come, as far as SB 966, for instance. Amelia in the past has experience as a project manager for complex design applications like green roofs, living walls, and green infrastructure applications. She has an MS in civil and environmental engineering from UC Davis. She spent 2 years post-grad conducting research for Caltrans on-site water reuse projects. And prior to joining Sherwood, Amelia worked with numerous water and wastewater utilities. She's also, because she has such spare time, program manager for Sherwood's Innovation Lab, and has been incubating the development of Sherwood's water and wastewater systems team, and she's championing of integrated water systems and engineering. A San Francisco native, she did spend 2 summers in Uganda building UDD toilets, and I'm sure she'd be happy to tell you about that in detail some other time. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Anne to take over the screen.
I think actually Amelia's gonna go first this time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
After all that, Amelia's going first.
Yes, thank you. Let's see if this works here. Go into presentation mode. How does that look for everybody?
We're good.
Okay, great. Well, I came up with a very creative title of On-Site Non-Potable Water Systems, Engineering Practices and Local Regulation. But hopefully my talk will be a little bit more exciting than the title. But yeah, as Dennis mentioned, I have had the opportunity to work on a lot of systems. The sort of, you'll hear me speak a little bit about sort of vocabulary and how we talk about on-site non-potable water. What you will find is that the statewide sort of standard now is on-site non-potable water systems, or ONWS. But there's a lot of different ways in which people refer to these systems. So I'll get into some definitions here, talk about the opportunity, what is it that we are really presenting to you as stakeholders in this industry today. Talk about sort of what I do best, what I do every day, which is the engineering design practice, and why we really have to focus on getting it right. And then I will touch on, as Dennis alluded to, Senate Bill 966. So it's sort of in process now at the state level, and what it means for local programs, especially here in Silicon Valley. And a little bit about my experience in corporate water stewardship, and just some closing thoughts on what might be next for the industry. I do like to put this quote on the left into presentations because it really just highlights that there are many stacked benefits with implementing on-site non-potable water systems, and they span across both the sort of utility and developer arenas. So the opportunity, I like to use this graphic from Leverance and Shabanaglas, being a UC Davis kid. And what you see here are a couple of different typologies for what can be called satellite water reuse, right? So the idea that a water reuse plant can actually be a satellite orbiting the city or community's water infrastructure. On the top left, you see sort of an you see an upstream type, so maybe a community that has a water reuse system at the sort of lower end of the collection system, the sewer system for that community. On the bottom left, you see what we call sort of an interception type. Some might call it sewer mining, right? So taking wastewater that's flowing through an existing pipe and as needed, treat that for non-potable applications. On the top right, you see a individual home. So some folks might be more familiar at the local level with a residential gray water system that feeds water from showers and lavatory sinks to water, say, a fruit tree. Very, very basic, but also falls into this arena of an on-site non-potable water system, but very simple to implement. On the bottom right, you see what might be sort of what I think about this day and age when we talk about these on-site non-potable water systems, which is kind of this extraction type, meaning that as an individual building, you are kind of extracting the wastewater from that building and reusing it on site. And that the scale at which that is done is something that I'll speak to here. But one of the great opportunities that we have with implementing these distributed solutions is that you can treat the water to fit the end use purpose. For example, you might have a different water quality objective for, say, industrial cooling versus irrigation of a park or flushing toilets. So fit for purpose water reuse is an advantage of this type of approach. So I just like to throw a few ideas out there about what that opportunity is. I mentioned residential buildings, I mentioned some commercial buildings, right? So it's not always about extracting wastewater. It can also be about harvesting rainwater or harvesting stormwater, two very different supplies that can then be used for, say, what you see in the top right there is to use for cooling applications, right? And what we tend to see with the use of rainwater and stormwater is that it's quite seasonal here, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And on the bottom right, you might see a more of a district, and this is representing a mining system that I described above, and for uses like golf course irrigation or even agricultural applications. So it's taking that water supply where it is most needed. And on the bottom left, you will see both gray water and black water, as they're called. Together, they are wastewater coming together for an on-site treatment to kind of hit the big three, as I like to call them, the non-potable water uses of irrigation, toilet flush, and cooling, which is what we really do see on these site-level commercial buildings. I like to give this precedent to highlight that this infrastructure approach is not purely something that's deployed on a private level or even a site level. This is down in the LA area. The West Basin Sanitary District has for many decades now deployed a distributed approach to water reuse. So on the left is showing the recycled water network associated with that for distribution, and on the right is showing some of their facilities distributed throughout that network that perform reuse and other purification functions to serve that network. So this is really a satellite network that is deployed at the public utility level to help diversify the water supply down in Southern California. So a region that optimizes the system to take advantage of ideal scale will reap the benefits in terms of resilience, cost, GHG emissions, water security. So I won't get too much into benefits here. Anne actually has a great presentation that from a report she and the Pacific Institute are working on. And so I'll just give you a teaser there. But this is a nice graphic in terms of thinking about the network, right? So I've keep on kind of talking about these networks. Well, sort of in network theory and thinking, right? If you have a lot of redundancy, right? A great engineering term, redundancy. It's great. You have so much resilience, but that's costly. So we can't have too much redundancy. But if you don't have enough redundancy, you have these very fragile nodes that if they break, you sort of lose, you can lose a whole branch of a network. So what we are trying to balance here as we kind of rethink the way we supply and treat water at an urban level is what's that right balance of costliness and redundancy. So I'd like to share that graphic. So engineering design and why it matters to get it right. I'd like to point to some resources. There have been just some really great work, especially here in the Bay Area, on this topic. The on-site non-potable water reuse practice guide, I believe it was published in 2017. This is actually linked now on the State Water Board's website for the web page that links to the development of SB 966. So a well-accepted resource for those considering these systems. So highly recommend getting yourself a copy of that. In addition, we have the National Blue Ribbon Commission for On-Site Non-Potable Water Systems, U.S. Water Alliance. Those are great national resources that have a number of really great publications. SFPUC has been a partner with those organizations. And then I like to highlight Renew It, which is a research collaborative with including Berkeley and Stanford here locally. And especially Stanford has their Codiga pilot facility now, which has just been a tremendous resource for pilot testing of novel and small scale technologies. So the reinventing of our nation's urban water infrastructure is indeed what we are doing. So I like to highlight that great academic resource that we have here in Silicon Valley. So the engineering, water balance concept. So water balance is this concept that in a given sort of, as we like to say in the engineering world, control volume, right? For a given area of analysis, we have to balance our resources. And so more and more what we see is as you know, new developments or existing areas are looking at how best to manage their water resources, we have to kind of do an accounting. And so what you see here is just an example of doing that accounting and trying to understand, again, what is the opportunity? This is really our first chance in the design process to identify where are our resources and within that study area, and what are our demands? And it sounds simple enough, but as you can see with this diagram, it can get quite complex when we start to take in all of the environmental water from rainfall, you know, all of the end uses, evaporative cooling, things like that, and some of the maybe more unique potable water uses. And of course, potable water that makes it down the drain is a great resource as wastewater. So just to kind of keep it simple here, there are some considerations when we think about how we size these on-site non-potable water systems. So I'm going to focus in the next series of slides on a wastewater treatment system. In the wastewater world, we have flows and we have loads. That's sort of how we think about sizing treatment plants. But there's other on-site considerations, like at what pace are those flows coming and how we equalize them? What's the water quality? What are my discharge requirements? So really focusing here on flows and loads, we can start to understand for maybe a facility where we don't have an understanding of what that water quality might be for a new building. We have to use the information we have, which is this idea of a program, the building program, to really identify how the system needs to be designed. There otherwise is no data. So I'd like to kind of use this SketchUp or bubble diagram just to point out, when we talk about program, what are we talking about? Well, if it's this is an example of a school, right? How many students, how many people might come and visit the auditorium? Are people taking showers? Are there visitors, right? These are all very detailed considerations that have to be taken into account when you're looking at developing an on-site wastewater treatment system. We like to look at over the course of a day, how many people are coming in, when are they there? And so this is just taking an example from the mechanical engineering world and applying it here to the water world, where we look at flow patterns and understand over the course of a week, a day, how is this building, how is this facility being used? So this is a critical component of looking at the design engineering process. So we take a FTE, what are full-time equivalents, and how much water they're using, the flows, how long are they there, this idea of dwell time, what load are they exerting while they're at this facility, right? It's not that people are living here, right? They go home at the end of the day if it's a school or institution. And so we end up with what we call wastewater characterization. So this is a very, very important part of the engineering design process and cannot be skipped. So then we decide, okay, what do we need to take? How do we take the waste out of this water? And generally we can think of solids, organics, and pathogens as being these sort of categories that we need to look at. So when we do the treatment design, we're looking at all of these factors. And then I'll also just broaden the net a little bit. I said I would talk about seasonality. So what we see here is that in the summer, we have a very high peak. Most folks, I think a lot of the regional non-potable water systems are really serving irrigation demand. There are, of course, some dual plumb buildings where we can use that non-potable water for flushing toilets. And as I mentioned, evaporative cooling. But irrigation is really one of the major uses for non-potable water, at least today. And so what we see is that we have a very high demand in the summer months there. June, July are shown as kind of the peak in this graph. And then we have the sort of natural supply of rain when we don't really need irrigation. But we don't have enough of that rain to really store it and use it throughout the rest of the year. That would be expensive. So that's where we really have this constant supply of wastewater coming in. And so seasonal variability is also a very important part of the engineering process. And here's just an example where we looked at a project that had evaporative cooling. And what if they were able to achieve that cooling on the mechanical engineering level without using water? How does that impact it? Well, in this case, it made it so that the wastewater production was high enough to meet all of the non-potable demands, even at that peak summer season. So that's a really critical evaluation to do for an on-site system, because what we see regionally is that it's actually very hard to meet all of those seasonally peak demands. And we often end up supplementing in our peak demand season with potable water because we don't have the resource. So this is an evaluation that really helps us to identify the right infrastructure for a project. So why does this all matter? You may or may not be able to read the text on this slide, but going back to that water reuse practice guide, integrating this kind of thinking into a design process has to really happen from the beginning. So if you refer to that guide, you'll see these decision points along the way, even before design starts, right, in the planning of a project. There needs to be some consideration, because these are infrastructure systems, of all of this, all the way down to that detailed understanding of program. So if you don't have that type of integration with the design, you sometimes fail to meet the demands of that project. And we want to make sure these systems are successful and designed to meet the needs of that project. There is no one size fits all when it comes to a on-site reuse system. So now we'll get into the regulatory part, which is always fun. How I like to kind of talk about this is that we currently do have some barriers to implementation that are regulatory. So right now, depending on whether your source water is stormwater or wastewater, and I use this just as a point of comparison, you're actually following a very different permitting pathway today. There are plumbing codes that can be used for, say, permitting of stormwater. Curiously, stormwater is sort of categorized as a gray water in the plumbing code, which, as an engineer, they're very different sources. So, our current code doesn't really consider all of the importance of the distinction of how we think about these sources. And from a wastewater standpoint, all of these projects are permitted through the regional boards. Here in San Francisco, the SF Bay Regional Board, which is, there's a couple different pathways, but each project has to sort of make that determination on their own. It's kind of an individualized approach, and it's a little bit of a square peg in a round hole, let's say, because these regulations, what you see here, the California Code of Regulations, Title 22 in that top right box, was really written in the late 90s, mid 90s for municipal recycled water plants. So, you know, we're lucky to have some great advocates at the regional board who are, you know, helping to usher these permits along, but it is not a system that's suited to these types of scales. So what we have is now the Senate Bill 966 that's been passed, and today the State Division of Drinking Water is working on the technical requirements, which will be done in about 2 years, at which point there will be a codification of those technical requirements. Those technical requirements are called the risk-based framework. I'm not going to get too much into that today. It sort of was developed with the Blue Ribbon Commission that I mentioned earlier, SFPUC being a key player in that. It's a concept borrowed somewhat from drinking water regulations, with the idea being to focus on the quality of that source water, especially on pathogens, and the sort of safe level of reduction in those pathogens based on the source water to protect public health. So it's a public health oriented framework, and it sort of takes this disparate way in which we do it now and creates a single technical framework for statewide adoption. So there's not this variability in terms of how the public health element of our regulations are being met. But the interesting part is sort of, if you look at the letter of the law, and certainly this is a topic that I'm hoping spurs lots of discussion, but I did extract these kind of like 5 major points from that legislation. So if you go onto the California legislative information, you can find the bill text. And you know what the bill is trying to do is to push the burden away from the state level for on-site systems to the local jurisdictions. So the state would really move to this role of reviewing annual reports that come from these local jurisdictions. It's notable, early on I mentioned some of the smaller residential systems, like taking untreated gray water and using it to water fruit trees on your property in your backyard. That type of system doesn't really involve any treatment, and it's not addressed by this regulation. Same with rainwater reuse, rain barrels at the home. And so then what we will see as the SB 966 is codified is that the permitting pathway will shift to these local jurisdictions, which is defined as a city and county. So local programs really have to be established for both existing and new systems. And it's very clear in the regulation that if there's no local program, there's no on-site non-potable water system. So I think that there are some folks committed to seeing a sort of smooth transition here, but there is a goal here at the state level to move the permitting to a local jurisdiction. And of note is that water and sewer providers, can and should be incorporated into the program formation. And if they do identify adverse impacts, such as reduced flows to a sewer system, that local jurisdiction may be required to mitigate for it. So it's really important to be in partnership with that. And I like to point to this as a framework for governance structures. So as we start to understand what these local programs will be doing, it's important to understand that we're not just talking about individual buildings. We can also be talking about like an eco district, right, or a multi-building approach. And so how those, who becomes what's called the responsible management entity for those systems, and how that gets structured from a governance standpoint is an important consideration. So I won't walk you through this. It's an example of how a specific eco district in Portland was formed. So it does take some thinking, as you can see here. But district water reuse and the benefits that come along with the economies of scale going to, now this is not your local water wastewater district. This is a term that has been deployed sort of on the development scale to look at multiple parcel systems that can collect water and distribute water across a whole development area. So I wanted to introduce that terminology. And just state that this is really a call for local leadership to try to understand some of the complexities at the governance level, and understand that when we do get state regulations, they will mostly be focused on the technical side of implementing these systems and the protection of public health, which is what the Division of Drinking Water's role is. But the local governance component of SB 966 is really to be determined. And so, you know, what can we do locally to ensure that we have diverse water reuse infrastructure? So I'll go through just really quickly a few projects. Corporate water stewardship, you know, is really looking at environmental concerns, water security, and long-term costs, frankly. So some might be familiar with the Microsoft campus locally. My firm was involved with the concept design here, which achieved just a great win in terms of reduction in water resources, and it's under construction today. So this is what that water balance diagram looked like for that project as we started to understand the integration of some of the natural features as well as the water resources available. I mentioned that seasonal water balancing act. So this project actually implements a lot of storage on site to do this balancing act. I won't get into the details of this, but just to show that, you know, there is some detailed engineering that goes into the treatment process. And there are a lot of great technology precedents for this scale of system. And so at the end of the day, we're looking not just at the functional use of that water, but how does it interact with the landscape around it? And how are we managing that water seasonally? And then quickly, I'll give you a sort of sneak peek at the Google Bayview project. It's something that is an interesting opportunity to look at the network connectivity in terms of where in our existing network does an on-site system make sense. And here we have just a diagram showing that the regional facility where this wastewater from the campus would go is quite far away, and there is an existing issue with saltwater intrusion. And given the water that's potable water that serves this area is imported from far away, you know, what can we do as we develop a campus to mitigate for some of these existing conditions? So again, we looked at a water balance that was able to demonstrate that we have enough collection of rainwater, stormwater, and wastewater to meet all of the project's demands and then some. So this is really a great opportunity for an on-site system, and I hope that we all can see more of this project in the future. So I will wrap up with just a few slides here. This is a very boring slide, but I like to point it out that what's next? Well, what you'll see and what you'll see in Anne's presentation is that we're starting to deconstruct in the you know, academic and practical literature of the benefits and barriers for implementing on-site reuse. And I just like to point out that there's over a decade, you know, more than a decade of work that has gone into looking at some of these systems and, you know, proven out again and again that there are really great benefits to exploring this, these distributed solutions. And just to understand that there are investments in water infrastructure will happen, and this is just a graph showing what we see for some of our regional water suppliers, that there's going to be an increase in cost, and we know that. And so how are we preparing for that? How are we preparing for that in how our, on the both the public and private sides? And then what projects should be built in response to climate change, to urbanization, to you know, aging infrastructure and regulatory constraints, not just in terms of the changing on-site reuse infrastructure, but more constraints on what we can discharge to the bay as we discover the water quality impacts there. So when you start to really understand a lot of these sort of stressors, we need as many tools in the toolbox as we can get. And that's what these systems can provide to us if done well. So with that, well, thank you, and hand the screen back over to Dennis and Anne.
Thank you, Amelia. And thanks for people that started the questions. So we're queuing those up. And actually, Anne, yeah, if you take over the screen and forge ahead. There we go. Great.
There we go. All right. Everyone can see that. There we go. All right, and so what I'm going to be talking today is really complementary to what Amelia's been talking about, and I'm going to be discussing some of realizing the regional benefits of on-site water systems in Silicon Valley. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is primarily from a recent report that we're working on, which is the role of on-site water systems in advancing water resilience in Silicon Valley. And the team for this project, included Heather Cooley, Cor Kammeyer, Darcy Bostic, and myself. And this report will be coming out in early January of 2021. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. So I want to start by talking about regional stakeholder perspectives on on-site water systems, discuss some of the potential benefits of these systems, and finish with kind of two questions. So how do we ensure the benefits of on-site systems are realized, and what benefits can on-site systems provide in Silicon Valley specifically? So with our work on regional stakeholder perspectives, so my colleague Cora interviewed 23 different stakeholders in the region, and the chart on the right-hand side shows kind of the variety of these stakeholders we talked to. They represented a wide variety of different sectors. And the report includes kind of a synthesis of some of these interview responses. But some of the key themes that came out of this work were corporate motivations for on-site system investments. So Amelia really touched on a lot of these, hedge against rising water and wastewater rates, furthering corporate sustainability goals, a desire for water security. All these things are, really important motivators for these projects. Likewise, there was a lot of discussion of the role of corporations in water management broadly. So, on the positive side, a lot of people viewed it as a great opportunity for advancing innovation. A lot of these corporations have greater capacity to experiment with different approaches and things like that. Likewise, leveraging private capital for public benefit. But there were also some reservations that were raised, including corporate control and accountability concerns, equity and affordability, particularly when we think about water rate structures and if there were large-scale implementations, some of the shifts that could occur. And likewise, there's a lot of discussion around what the future water supply portfolio in the Bay Area should look like. And I think there's broad consensus on diversification, but it's, what should that diversification look like practically? So with that, between the interviews and a review of the literature, we saw that there's a ton of potential benefits of on-site non-potable water systems. This can include, water quantity, so supply augmentation, water quality, energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's trade-offs with different scales of infrastructure and things like that. Infrastructure benefits, finances, innovation, organizational reputation, policy goals, and finally, meeting regulatory requirements, and as well as resilience. This is kind of a cross-cutting theme, but in total, we identified 28 potential benefits that span these kind of 9 themes you see here. So, we recognize that there are a lot of potential benefits, but a lot of these benefits, particularly at the system level, often go unrealized. So in this section, I really want to talk about strategies and considerations for ensuring that this kind of broader range of benefits gets realized as we're implementing these projects. But I want to start with, with a couple of kind of key concepts. Realizing a lot of the benefits associated with on-site systems really requires designing, planning, and operating these systems as nodes in the larger water system. And so the figure on the right is, just your typical water system with on-site water systems included in that. And what we can kind of take away from this is at the system level, there's multiple feedbacks and dependencies, as well as very complex stakeholder relationships. And so we just want to, kind of have this in our mind as we think about some of these broader system level benefits, such as, offsetting imported supply or ability to, downsize infrastructure, kind of those sorts of things. Likewise, You know, we also know that there are a lot of potential beneficiaries of on-site systems. So this begins with the site that's actually implementing, implementing the system, and there's clear benefits there. But those benefits can, when managed appropriately, can extend outwards to include water, wastewater, and recycled water systems, as well as people, communities, and kind of broader ecosystems that these systems exist within. So we know that there are multiple beneficiaries, but realization of benefits across all these different stakeholder groups really requires intentionality, integration, and oftentimes scaling of these types of systems. So just to kind of recap, when we're thinking about realizing the benefits of on-site non-potable water systems, so we have the project itself, and then we have the broader context that these projects occur in. And really it's the integration of these two things that determine what the realized benefits are kind of at the regional or system level. And as we are going through this and thinking about well, how do we best realize and maximize the benefits associated with these systems, as we were thinking through it, the issue of context really just kept on coming up for us, and so we kind of summarized this in a list of kind of contextual factors that are determinants of whether or of how these kind of regional or system level benefits get realized. So there's at the foundation of this is location. So this is proximity to existing recycled water networks, elevation differences, just these very practical kind of location considerations. Time, a lot of these benefits accrue over very different time scales. Some of them might be realized, more immediately, whereas others, others take a longer time to be fully realized. The magnitude of the outputs from these systems. So, how much water is being produced by an on-site system, greenhouse gas emissions, all those sorts of things. Likewise, the scale of the system, so there's kind of trade-offs in economies of scale between, treatment and conveyance. And this is a really important factor. And there's been a lot of really great work done kind of around optimization modeling, looking at system scale and some of these other factors. Likewise, the state of the existing water infrastructure. So, when we think about, downside ability to, for instance, downsize infrastructure and things like that, whether that infrastructure is nearing the end of its design life or, has a long life or was recently upgraded, it has an impact on whether those benefits get realized. Likewise, governance structure, and this is really important. In the Bay Area, we have a multitude of different ways in which, water, sewer, wastewater treatment, recycled water agencies operate. In some instances, you'll have a very integrated agency managing multiple components. In other areas, conveyance will be managed separately from treatment, and the incentives for on-site systems vary a lot depending on kind of what the existing governance structure is. And likewise, institutional support. I think the issue of integrating these systems into regional planning efforts is very important, and even more so with SB 966. So just what institutional structures are in place to support the implementation, integration of these systems. And so I want to hone in on one specific kind of contextual factor that is talking about here, and this is the issue of location. And so the map that you see on the right-hand side basically looks at MTC's priority development areas for the Bay Area. And this is overlaid with the existing recycled water network in Santa Clara County, existing office park areas, and as well as communities of concern. And so, just thinking about the practicalities of on-site water systems, the biggest opportunities exist in locations where there's new or redevelopment type projects. Likewise, commercial, industrial, and multifamily residential properties, produce a large amount of wastewater. And so there's just more supply available at those sites. And likewise, areas that are not served by existing recycled water supplies. or areas where the quality of existing recycled water supplies doesn't meet the needs of the different uses. And so what we can kind of take away from this is, when we look at the existing network in Santa Clara County, we can see areas where there's new development that's being projected, that could really potentially benefit from on-site systems. And this figure only shows Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County has kind of the most extensive recycled water network at the present time. But when we look at San Mateo County, there's there's a broad area along the El Camino corridor that where there's projected to be big increases in multi-use development projects and growth and things like that. So we see a lot of opportunities in San Mateo County as well, actually. So just to kind of summarize, we see a lot of potential benefits of on-site systems, and these benefits can benefit many different stakeholders. And benefits can also accrue across multiple scales, such as the site, water system, community. But context ultimately determines the realization and magnitude of benefits. And so kind of one of our main takeaways from this was really that realizing this full range of benefits of on-site systems is going to require stakeholder collaboration, integration with regional planning efforts. And so with that, I want to use that as an opportunity to kind of transition to some work we did looking at the types of benefits that on-site systems can provide in Silicon Valley, and think of in a more spatially explicit way about realizing these benefits in the region. So I want to start talking about the water supply benefits of on-site systems. So the figure on the left-hand side shows the water agencies in the Bay Area, and the areas that have kind of hatched blue line, those are the areas that are receiving water from the SF regional water system. And so this is mostly imported water from the Hitachi system. And even within the region, there's a lot of variation in how much of the water supply is imported. So in San Mateo County, upwards of 90% of water supplies are imported. Santa Clara is in the range of 60-some%, but uses a much larger portion, or much larger quantity of water overall. So we can see that as a region, we're really dependent on imported supplies. And so it's very logical that when we talk about supply diversification, we want to think about reuse and on-site reuse in particular, and its capacity for kind of offsetting imported water supplies. So to look at this, we did just a really basic analysis comparing imported supply to the potential supply available for on-site reuse and potential demand for on-site reuse. And I just want to caveat this with, so this is data from DWR's water balance modeling. And, so this is kind of regional scale data. And this represents an upper bound of, the water supplies available and things like that. So it's a very, it's a very high level assessment, but it does provide some really interesting insights. And there's a lot of analogs to what Amelia was discussing with site level water balances and things like that. We see a lot of these kind of same issues arising at the regional level. So when we look at imported supply, which is the blue bar you see here, and compare it to indoor water use, which is this kind of dark yellow bar that's there, we see that commercial, industrial, and multifamily indoor use, it accounts for roughly 64% of imported supplies. So, if we manage to reuse the water from those systems, it's a sizable portion of our imported supply in the region. And if we actually, interestingly, if we factored in indoor water use from residential properties, that is roughly equivalent to the imported supplies in the region. However, then we compare the water that's used at these commercial, industrial, institutional, multifamily sites, and compare the indoor use to the outdoor use. And we see that outdoor use at these sites, or an approximation thereof, is roughly 30% of indoor use. So again, we're seeing this kind of supply-demand supply demand gap there. And so when we think about, we really want to maximize these, the water supply benefits of, of reuse and on-site reuse and things like that. So it's like, okay, well, how can we think creatively about this to, to kind of address that gap? And so what we can, I think a couple of things that came out of this is, a lot of these on-site projects have focused primarily on primarily on use for outdoor irrigation, and that's a very important water use, but want to make sure that, particularly in new developments, thinking about indoor uses such as toilet flushing and cooling as well. And the other thing is thinking about whether there's opportunities to supply water from these on-site systems to benefit the broader community. So things like irrigating nearby parklands. And so in this map, we basically looked at proximity of existing parklands within Santa Clara County to existing recycled water supply networks. And so currently about 114 out of 659 parks in Santa Clara County are connected to existing or adjacent to existing recycled water supplies. So when we overlay this with areas where there could be opportunities for on-site systems, we can see that there's, there may be opportunities to provide some broader community benefits through landscape irrigation of public green spaces. And likewise, this is especially important in, we also looked at, where a disadvantaged community is located relative to these areas and things like that. And, those benefits are even more important in areas such as those. The other major benefit of on-site systems that we looked at here was thinking about infrastructure augmentation. And so one of the major challenges we have moving forward in the Bay Area is, of course, sea level rise. And so what this map kind of highlights here is sea level rise and looking at where that intersects with existing recycled water networks, as well as office, existing office parks and things like that. And we can see that these both economic and water system nodes within our region are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. And so it really behooves us to think about where there are opportunities for on-site systems to serve as nodes to support these systems. So we see this flooding in lower elevations, but the kind of interesting other side of that same coin is that we're also expecting increased outdoor water demand with hotter and drier conditions. So so you have both flooding and increased outdoor water demand. So really thinking creatively about where can on-site water systems help build resiliency in these systems, and furthermore thinking about connectivity with existing infrastructure systems, so that these systems can truly act as supplemental or satellite infrastructure in all cases. Likewise, one of the other kind of infrastructure augmentation benefits of on-site systems that gets talked about a lot is thinking about the potential to downsize or defer infrastructure investments in the region through the use of on-site water systems. And so what we did here is we mapped MTC's priority development areas relative to the existing sewer network in San Jose. And we only have data for San Jose for that, so that's all we have here. But and this is important because on-site water systems are most feasible in areas where there's basically new or redevelopment projects. We know our existing sewer system is aging, and certainly in some areas, it was designed for very different land uses than we're looking at now. So it's not necessarily adequate for the anticipated flows in various dimensions. So again, thinking about where there are opportunities for on-site systems to where they can help reduce the scale of infrastructure upgrades required, or contribute to, cost sharing in that regard, or, those sorts of things. We see a lot of opportunities across the region. So just to kind of wrap up and summarize, we see a lot of opportunities for on-site systems, but these are most feasible in, areas targeted for redevelopment, areas that are not served or underserved by current infrastructure. And two main classes of benefits that we saw include supply augmentation. Thinking about, but this requires, maximizing the water supply benefits requires, is going to really require offsetting indoor non-potable uses in addition to outdoor, and, finding additional nearby users, that we can magnify the opportunities of, or magnify the benefits provided by these systems if we can, think broader than the site. Likewise, scaling really magnifies the value of system level benefits in the range of beneficiaries. When we think about the amount of water that you can offset with a single site versus 500 sites or 1,000 sites, when you start scaling these systems, that's when you really start to realize a lot of these kind of bigger kind of system level benefits. Likewise, we see a lot of opportunities for infrastructure augmentation. Sea level rise is a major challenge we're facing in the region, and there's clear geographies where on-site systems can help address these challenges. But the other takeaway on the infrastructure augmentation piece was that realizing a lot of these infrastructure augmentation benefits does really require intentionality and integrated planning of these systems. So the next steps with this work is the report will be the report that features a lot of the work I talked about today will be coming out in January, and we're starting to move into phase 2 for this project, which consists of a variety of stakeholder convenings and a synthesis report from from those activities. So with that, thank you, and totally happy to answer any questions. If you're interested in some of the phase 2 work, feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, we will get to questions that have been forming. I will ask the first one, which is becoming something of a tradition, and that is the Felicia Marcus magic wand question. And I should say that Taylor Chang of SFPUC had a question along the similar lines, and I'll ask that as well, because we'll go from somewhat general to specific. The Felicia Marcus magic wand question is simply, if you had a magic wand, how would you use it for the topic at hand? So what is your best case or best kind of result, say, on on-site water reuse implementation in Silicon Valley? Taylor asks, actually in the Bay Area even, but if you had one ask of the state while they develop SB 966 regulations, what would it be? So, yeah, as you can see, that's a somewhat similar question. So, any thoughts on that, Anne or Amelia?
I will take a first stab. Maybe Taylor's question is easier, so I will answer that first, and then Anne, maybe you can have a magic wand answer as well. But as far as this SB 966 and the state's work, I would say training, right? So we have at the county level currently, there are public health staff, and I would venture to say that probably the county level is the most appropriate level for a local program because of that, because public health programs are managed at that level. And also just in terms of scale, but I would say that there's not, currently staff at the county level that are trained in water, wastewater, environmental engineering. And so it does take a certain knowledge of how these systems work to effectively permit them and effectively implement a program. So I would say, you know, the ability to train up staff for local programs so that they understand the intent of the risk-based framework regulations and sort of are able to formulate successful programs, perhaps learning from the program that San Francisco has put together and all of the national resources around that. As far as the magic wand goes, I will put on my engineering cap and say, you know, we're often constrained by, you know, public-private property boundaries when the best engineering solution might be using both public and private infrastructure on public and private parcels. So my magic wand would be, you know, that there's let's say governance infrastructure that exists to allow for more ready sharing of infrastructure, so that there's less sense of risk of taking on public taking on private and private taking on public infrastructure.
Anne.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think honestly, I would echo a lot of what Amelia just said, and yeah, I really think the institutional support for kind of the managerial and financial components of implementing SB 966 are really going to be at the crux of the the success of this program, and so I think that's that's a major gap, and yeah, and in terms of magic wand. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, yeah, I think that, I think in our work looking at the different benefits, I mean, I think we really saw that, there's so many of these benefits that, yeah, if you could just get people to work together and collaborate and like think about, infrastructure as a regional system, that you can really just, you can amplify a lot of these benefits to a much greater degree. And like, particularly when it comes to, a lot of the resilience related benefits and things like that, I think, yeah, that's what I'd love to see.
Yeah, I will be in the coming months, I'll be talking a lot more about the water grid. Amelia kind of touched on that a bit in terms of taking a little bit of, say, electric or energy structures and things like, the existing energy grid, just if as it's applicable to kind of bring into a water environment. I mean, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but I think this idea of perhaps having a larger regional view and better kind of planning consciousness of water systems, that it's not a discrete network of pipes, but it's something that possibly could have some interconnection, literal and figurative interconnection benefits. Anyway, moving along, we have a question, an anonymous question, but that goes as such. Is there a minimum size parcel that can be used for this type of project? I think this was asked during Amelia's kind of campus presentation. Is it more aimed at a campus versus one building?
I think, I mean, it's a great question, and scale is really sort of the name of the game when you're trying to understand what the best engineering solution is. But I wouldn't say that, it's always a large scale system that wins at the end of the day. It actually does come down to water balance. So what we find, for example, is that in residential buildings, I mentioned program, right? So if you have a residential building where there's water use for laundry and more showers and basically more gray water generation, what you find is that you generally don't have a use for all of that wastewater that you're generating. So it may be perfectly appropriate in that case if you're sort of grid connected to utilize just gray water for that building to flush toilets, and that's a perfectly appropriate sort of basically closed loop system to a certain extent. Whereas, you know, when you start to scale up, especially as you're looking at, you know, a fuller district that might be more mixed use, you might be able to see a benefit for a larger scale system that has the ability to say, you know, irrigate a large park in the area to meet, you know, what would be that peak summer demand. Yes, in terms of, you know, the actual sort of infrastructure and equipment investment, it can be, you would see an economy of scale for building a larger facility. But you may also see on this sort of micro scale what Anne talked about, which is the trade-off between location and conveyance, right? So as you're building infrastructure, even within a campus, so there'd be a university or a institutional or corporate campus, there may be, you know, extra collection infrastructure that you wouldn't have to build if you focused on a smaller area. So even at that micro scale, the collection distribution infrastructure can add cost. So maybe not as black and white of an answer as you may have been hoping for, but I would say that, you know, water balance would dictate, and, you know, kind of optimizing for context, as Anne mentioned, but certainly just naturally there is an economy of scale for building a larger facility, but it doesn't preclude smaller projects from being very successful and even have a return on the investment.
So the right water for the right job. Still not quite down to a bumper sticker, but perhaps. Kind of in the same vein in terms of campus systems, specific question from Carol Steinfeld about the Microsoft system. Has it been turned on yet?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's going through what's called clean water startup right now. So the system is built and in place, and they're working through all the hydraulics and startup. And then as the building becomes occupied and over the next months, they'll do what's called seeding of the system, where you bring in an active biology from a different plant and do what's called the biological startup. So 2021, I'm told.
Yes, and just as one of the many remaining plugs I'll make for Waterpalooza, we will have a number of kind of reports on that and other systems coming into play. We'll be releasing information on that pretty much every day starting next week up until the event. Let's see, another question from Alan White to Anne. While we understand, quote, intentionality, unquote, at a high level, can you give any examples in the state or elsewhere of how this has worked in practice? Have there been successes that provide wins for all the stakeholders you referenced?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I hope Amelia can maybe chime in some more like specific examples of projects and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think with intentionality, it's you know, I think this gets back to actually some great points that Amelia made in her presentation about, you know, thinking about the integration of these systems from the outset, you know, from the conceptualization of the project, you know, before you get down into the nitty-gritty of design and things like that. It's really, you know, it's really about thinking about it from that, you know, from that place, and bringing in the broad range of stakeholders, you know, from the outset. And, you know, it's not, you know, that like the community doesn't come in, you know, as an afterthought or as a, you know, it's like that they're engaged from the beginning. And I think that's you know, that's kind of what we're thinking. And in terms of specific, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Amelia to if she has any specific.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I would say I've been, you know, very focused in the Bay Area, but there are, you know, examples I would say throughout the world. One is a project in Sydney, Australia, that is a mixed use, both residential, commercial development that successfully deployed a membrane bioreactor type treatment plant, and worked with the local water and wastewater providers to design all the tie-ins for that, and provide in a place that like here is quite drought prone, provided a resilient water supply for a new mixed use development that sort of adds to the vitality of that district, and provides needed housing and offsets the resources needed for that. We can really define sort of the win-win in lots of different ways. I will sort of take the cop-out, which is to use SFPUC's example, where they were finding that the Southeast wastewater treatment plant was having capacity issues, and not wanting to constrain the city's ability to say build more housing with water supply issues. Their program is able to solve both constraints on the wastewater side and on the water supply side. In addition, the Southeast plant there is quite land constrained, so they actually don't have the space to build a recycled water facility. So what we see on the utility side is that there's very case specific examples where you have to look at that utility's constraints and that utility's infrastructure, both at the treatment plants and on the water supply side and the conveyance side, to understand how a program can really be structured to benefit the utilities constraints, and enable needed development in this case. So those are two examples, and I hope to have many more statewide and nationally.
Actually wanted to interject a question from Don Berger, who has had some technical issues and hasn't been able to join us, but texted me questions. One kind of struck me that it was related to what we were just talking about. Basically, where else are you seeing interest in commercial on-site systems? I think he was thinking more of a campus kind of level thing in California. Like, is there interest, in SoCal or Central Valley, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a few studies. I do tend to be on the feasibility side of things, which means that I'm aware of fewer operational systems, but I do work with companies that are on the operations side. And I believe that Caltech is developing a system. And so I think university campuses in general are, very keen to understand how they can utilize their scale to implement more water resilience and strategies and diversify their water supplies. So we're certainly working with a number of those at the feasibility side. And in terms of implementation, you also have a project that was conducted on the East Coast for Gillette Stadium, which is a great example where the stadium was facing, very large infrastructure costs to connect to the centralized plant, and was able to build a facility that could handle, the peak stadium load event and also supply that water to flush toilets. So, those are great examples of where, especially campuses that may be slightly on the outskirts of the existing network, can really benefit from on-site management.
Waterpalooza plug number 32. We will be having some use cases from outside the Bay Area as well that are quite interesting. I mean, that's one of the advantages, I guess, of having a virtual event. So moving along, here is actually a question from our very own Tristan. It's an equity question. What can stakeholders do to ensure the benefits of on-site water systems are environmentally just not only available to those, to say the private entities that can afford site level implementation. And so this gets, I think, into a bit of the, perhaps regional or almost neighborhood benefit possibilities.
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. Yeah, no, I think this is such a great point, and there's a lot of different ways. I mean, some of them are, quite frankly, like fairly low-hanging fruit, and others are, require a lot more, complexity. But low-hanging fruit, I mean, one of the big benefits we talk about with on-site systems is green space access, and with a lot of this, a lot of these systems occurring on private property. I mean, these campuses aren't necessarily close to the public or anything like that, but the surrounding communities may not view it as as a resource that they can access. So even just like community outreach and publicizing ability to access these spaces and things like that could help there, and that's fairly low-hanging fruit. On the other end of the spectrum, one thing that I'm really, really excited about with on-site systems is opportunities for like scalping type plants. Because you think about a lot of these facilities, are being built on these corporate campuses, and one of the big benefits is potential resilience and things like that. But if we think about like a major earthquake, or even with COVID, where people aren't working in these campuses, so you have these kind of stranded, they're potentially stranded assets when you have these major disaster type things. And so thinking about how do you plan these systems to better integrate with the existing wastewater network. So like, let's say in the event of an earthquake, you can redirect flows into the system on on a corporate campus. So you're treating it as like a true satellite facility. So just these kind of thinking about like flexibility and operation I think could really help bolster some of the the realization of some of these community benefits of these, particularly in in disaster type situations.
That's a great point, Ann. Thanks.
I might add on to that, Dennis, if I may.
Yes, please.
I think also this obviously like equity is front of mind for everybody right now, and I think one of the advantages of having we look at those that can afford to sort of be on the leading edge, but in a way it's paving a pathway, right, to make systems to sort of work through some of the kinks, right, and build up some of the engineering expertise and really push that sort of 20% of innovation that's needed to kind of bring the rest of the community along. And so in a way I would see that there's an opportunity to make the design, engineering, and implementation of these systems sort of more streamlined, more affordable for others through the work that's being done on the corporate sustainability side, at least from what we saw today. So a bit of a plug there. Obviously it's not an end all be all, but it's part of the equation as sort of these catalytic projects that can help drive change for the future projects.
Intelligent valves. Let's see. I just wanted to note something from Taylor Chang, who had sent this out to the chat, that she is working on a tag with USGBC. That's a technical advisory group with lead through water efficiency. So to develop a pilot credit that rewards water reuse projects for participating in integrated water management and collaboration with water and wastewater utilities. And that's a very interesting thing she's working on. It's obviously a national effort, and looking to reward projects for thinking in the broader context. And Taylor, we do need to talk for an upcoming event in December. I just wanted to call that out publicly. And Also, I know Amelia's just a follow-up question. You have a number of accreditations and have worked in a number of systems, like, you know, you are a lead AP, and you've even mentioned in our discussions yesterday the water pedal of Living Future and some of the other you know, kind of accreditation efforts, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts in that particular area as far as similar things with what Taylor was talking about.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not. We do at Sherwood have folks that sit within the what's called the Living Futures sort of group, helping to develop the frameworks like the water pedal. You know, yeah, maybe as an overview for folks, there's you know, there's programs. LEAD is probably the most widely adopted that folks are familiar with. I do have the legacy LEAD AP, which is not up to date, so I won't claim to be a total expert these days. And also for utilities, you know, Envision is becoming a more, for horizontal infrastructure, it's a more heavily utilized framework. And actually, what's an interesting part of the Envision framework is that there's an inherent need for that sort of stakeholder engagement. So an integral part of the Envision framework is stakeholder engagement. It's always been part of that certification pathway. So I think that that's a great framework for when you're talking about infrastructure and horizontal systems. LEAD has notoriously, you know, been energy focused framework, and I think with regional priority credits coming on in 4.0 and some of the shifts that we see, there's more ability to credit water systems, and I appreciate them bringing in this sort of stakeholder collaboration credit. Absolutely, that's essential. But I do see that, you know, LEAD tends to be a bit more prescriptive. For example, when you look at rain harvesting, it's you know, gives you sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, which of course is very different across different climates. And yeah, just to speak to the Living Building Challenge, as it's called, you know, their goal is to, you know, to be change makers and to sort of have those uncomfortable conversations around regulations and sort of shift the industry. And so, you know, when you saw companies aiming for that goal, the framework is not, you know, the sort of you know, let's go back to like cradle to cradle, right? Like, let's not do less bad, but let's actually, you know, be regenerative and be net positive and do more good. And I think that you know, initially in their framework translated to sort of, let's literally, you know, produce more water than we use, and that doesn't always work on a site scale. And so what we see is the Living Building Challenge framework for water, for the water pedal, as they call it, being a lot more flexible with respect to scale, a concept they call scale jumping, that is what's being deployed at the Google Bayview project that I mentioned, where they're looking at it much more like a water grid, and you know, how can you provide a net positive impact at not just at the site scale, where that may not be practical, especially when you're talking about drinking water supply and things like that. So that recognition that water infrastructure sort of inherently has tentacles out into the broader infrastructure framework, and defining net positive in a way that sort of works for all the stakeholders. So really seeing some great adaptations in the water industry for all of these frameworks. And you know, third-party certification is very important for a lot of people, and it's a very important market transformation driver. So it's great to see them adapting.
Anne, do you have any thoughts?
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, great. I did want to actually give a little bit of a shout out for another framework, and a little maybe perhaps less known, and that's Eddie Corwin's work with the Alliance for Water Stewardship. And I've had a little bit of insight into that, and it's a very interesting kind of watershed level view, and and hopefully in a future time we will have kind of a format and perhaps get into just even some of the thinking behind these accreditations regarding water and perhaps their impact as well. So perhaps I don't, that isn't quite on the agenda for December, but that sounds like an interesting thing in future to kind of round up some of these issues. I see here a late-breaking question from Eric Rosenblum. Some companies, for example, Sustainable Water in Richmond, Virginia, offer, quote, turnkey, unquote, operations where they finance, build, own, and operate on-site reuse systems for a monthly fee. I guess water as a service. How do these on-site strategies fit into regional planning?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Eric. That would fall into probably there's sort of the alternative governance structures that I talked about, which is really like how do these entities relate to the regulatory structure and existing utilities. Then there's also sort of project delivery models, and I didn't get into that today, but there's, in the world of design build, there's sort of a number of different iterations from that, and one of them is this idea of like design, build, own, operate, and finance. This is especially applicable for larger scale systems, but there are those that have the ability to deliver what are called turnkey solutions. Those solutions, I would encourage that they also go through all the engineering design process that I talked about. There is no black box or one size fits all. So just being aware that there's no turnkey technology solution, but from a delivery model solution standpoint, absolutely, it's a way to transfer the financial risk off of an individual owner onto a entity who has expertise and their own financing to go ahead and make these infrastructure investments. And then they structure it similar to how you might structure a power purchase agreement into what's called a water sort of supply agreement or a water purchase agreement that has a certain length of term and a set rate schedule, much like a utility would set rates. That's certainly a delivery model that is more applicable, I would say, to what we call these district scale or multi-parcel scale solutions, but it allows folks who, on the development side, who may not be interested in owning an asset of a wastewater treatment plant, to put that burden onto a separate entity. And there are certainly a few companies nationwide that have that business model and are able to bring that funding to the equation. Good question.
Kind of along with that, one question I always hear from, say, veteran managers of treatment plants is something along the lines of, why would a given company want to, run a treatment plant, essentially, like a campus-wide system and deal with the staffing and personnel and kind of regulatory things. And I've heard it asked as, almost a genuine question, like they're realizing what they do day to day, and then why would anybody want to do this? So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as, kind of as a question in terms of even the, go through motives of actually getting involved in this.
I'll just chime in real quick. I think, I think that's a great, I think that's a really great point. And I think, when we think about scaling these on-site systems, we have to remember that, right now, you have these, big technology campuses that have really been the leaders in this space, but if we really want to scale, we need to think about, okay, what are all the other commercial and industrial ownership structures for properties within, within the region and, and more broadly than that. And, yeah, like maybe these, these turnkey type solutions are going to be, a lower risk prospect for some of these different ownership structures and things like that. So I think that's, yeah, I think that's a really great point.
And Amelia, any thoughts on that? It's actually, as time goes, it'll be final thoughts, but.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there are a number of different ways that an owner, can decide to get into this space or not. I think as we, get more comfortable with what on-site systems are and what they mean and advancing technology, that it'll sort of become a more normal part of any given development, just like, HVAC infrastructure is in a certain way. So I think that we'll get more comfortable with that idea. You make the assumption, Dennis, that people don't enjoy being around wastewater. Speak for yourself.
I'm not speaking for myself. I'm fascinated. You should hear me talk about fog.
Exactly. So I think we'll see a more level of comfort, but certainly people will adapt at their own pace, and technology will evolve, and we'll start to see probably just more and more of these systems as is allowed by kind of the way that we're reinventing our water infrastructure. So I'm hopeful.
Well, hope is good, and today is hopefully a day of change and transition, and obviously that's going to spur a lot of hope as far as perhaps every day in the future will be infrastructure day. And in all forms. I would like to thank you, Anne and Amelia, for a great presentations and great work, and just really good discussion. And I actually would conclude with Carol Steinfeld had made, it wasn't so much a question as making some points about San Mateo and Santa Clara County, their political structures and will and interest in all of this, and just even some of the questions about water, imported water versus perhaps, reductions in imported water balanced with better use of wastewater. And so I would say, Carol, this is a discussion that obviously is going to continue in a much granular form as especially within the 966 framework. And so we'll have to leave it here, but I just wanted to express my appreciation once more and point to this event in December called Waterpalooza, which will take on some of these issues and just a whole lot of other things. A real water variety show. So hopefully you can tune in for that as well. So thanks again, and for now, goodbye.